Do 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 do. Extras.
Though the Headless Horseman legend was almost word for word from my notes, even if it was more clumsily delivered at the table, with interruptions, some stumbling over words, etc., this tale suffered much less from the issues of animating an oral medium story word for word compared to the fight scenes from Legends the Red Sash. Nevertheless, the section with Asmodeus felt a lot longer when trying to slap images on screen for the duration of it. And "the knight did good deeds during the day and made a friend" was so clunky to illustrate in the short space of time it took to say that I basically didn't. Woo, he chopped wood. Good deed, bro. Good deed. Overall, though, I am very happy with the results. I was trying to stylize the animation in two main ways. First, obviously, I was going with minimum detail, using monocolor silhouettes with single other color detail at most. That mostly makes it simpler to draw, as intended, but it does create other challenges, places where I had to play around with color and shapes in order to make two figures distinguishable. Though the opposite, making two figures indistinguishable, was pretty effective in the brief romantic scene, which may have been the only romantic scene I've ever drawn? Wow. The other big stylistic thing I was trying was to keep the camera moving the whole time. Adobe Animate has an adjustable camera feature I've been making increasing use of in recent episodes, and despite the fact that it is buggy as hell, pretty awful UI, it still makes more dynamic shots possible with much less effort when it works. Now, in practice, there were certain scenes that had to be more static, like the funeral pyre, or where movement was more trouble than it was worth, like the Asmodeus stuff. But the rest of the time, I tried to keep the camera always moving to the right at a constant pace, and the effect of some of the scene changes was pretty neat. I also narrowed the screen, framing it between two vertical bars to clearly separate it from the rest of the episode. Originally, I had a black gradient at the bottom for most of it, which helped hide some ugly animation bits, like putting Vaseline on a camera lens. But I realized toward the end of the process that it was really breaking the aesthetic by muddying that bottom bar. So, with some minor adjustments, I got rid of the gradient everywhere I possibly could, and the result is a much cleaner, more consistent look. As for the story, the twist is arguably a little questionable in that the wording of the bargain seems to apply figuratively, taking their head, meaning cutting it off, and yet not literally, the servant of Asmodeus literally taking the head off the ground. However, I might argue that maybe once the head was removed, it no longer belonged to the knight. Or perhaps Asmodeus and his subordinates can't count as your enemy when he's currently your boss, your patron in the warlock sense. Ultimately, though, we can't know the exact way the magic works, especially when the god making the deal probably decides much of it, and we can't even know how exact the wording was. After all, as I always say, any legend in my world is bound to accumulate an error or two, as it is passed down through the ages. Who knows what details may have been mistaken by those who have told the tale of the Headless Horseman. There was a little bit of confusion when I was trying to reconstruct the fighty part of the fourth challenge, though I didn't worry about that too much because the interesting parts were how the players reacted and moved around more than who killed what when. The problem is, while I had the recordings to go by, the only map of the clearing was a hand drawn on a piece of paper, because this was the kind of situation where I thought fussing over individual map grid squares would be more distracting and limiting than actually interesting strategy. This, however, meant that not only did I not have a turn-by-turn visual rundown of the positions of all creatures, as usual, but I actually didn't have even a real plan for the map going in. I just scribbled the location of the statues, and later pillars, in real time, because there wasn't supposed to be any pattern to them. Then, layer on top of that, the scribbled positions of the PCs and the tentacle casters, many of which were forced to change position by the vision-blocking junk the party dropped in round 1, The number of enemies I showed seemed to match up with the recording, but I definitely lost track of some details somewhere through the transcript. By the time I had edited most of the battle, I was pretty sure that the bottom and bottom right groups are actually the same group, but I couldn't quite figure out when exactly they moved from one spot to the other, just from the audio and the hand-drawn map, which is why some of them just kind of disappear during the fight without any mention in the episode. Most likely, that group was just 1 or 2 minions, plus the second wizard, i.e. non-minion version. And they moved to the second position to get around the Doomtide spell, but again, I just couldn't make sense of the timing. Some actions made it sound like they were in one position, some sounded like they were in the other. Now, I can't confirm to you, yet, whether the party chose the right or wrong Rygax to murder, since if they did choose wrong, it would probably have a significant effect on the next episode. Though, if you want to argue that killing the presumed fake was the wrong move regardless, well, you can make a pretty good argument. Because ultimately, removing a threat makes less difference here than it would in the so-called real world, given that the Outtro can create whatever threats they want, limited only by whatever celestial compact governs their fair play. It doesn't really matter whether there's a living Rygax or a corpse in their portable hole, because if Al wants to throw a monster at them, they're getting a monster. The only way it would be made more dangerous is if that monster was disguised as somebody they trusted, allowing it to strike at the worst possible moment. But I will say that the Outtro took their attempt to plane shift out with Kajord as an excellent opportunity to sow dissent by introducing a nightmare duplicate Rygax, because whichever Rygax was the real one, Al made sure that both of their stories sound technically plausible. Who knows what happened when Rygax entered the portal, disappearing from view for either a couple rounds or several minutes, depending which, if any, was the real one. But both also sound pretty suspicious if you think about them much. There have been a lot of theories in the YouTube comments and on the TDDC Discord server, which anyone can join, not just Patreon patrons, and people are correct to note that we know the real Cornello was outside fighting Swain from that episode 60 post-credit scene. But not only do the party not know that at the time, but they actually saw Cornello inside the realm of the Outtro, as discussed in the deleted scenes section of Extras number 60. That was a dumb encounter, nothing happened, and I removed it from TDDC because it had no impact on anything, except that it put in the PC's heads that Cornello was running around the woods. And as some other commenters pointed out, Nightmare Duplicate Cornello could still be either actually dangerous to a lone Rygax, or even just present himself as a big enough threat to trick Rygax into wasting his transformation. All of these things are possible, especially from the PC's point of view. It's up to you to decide which clues are real and which are red herrings. I still hold that both stories appeared plausible, and both also appeared suspect. Now, the episode went through the dynamics of the test the party came up with pretty thoroughly, so no sense going over that, until next extras anyway, but I did cut out a couple discussions. For one thing, Angel thought about getting both holy and unholy on different sides of her chain. Double weapons in 3.5 edition do get separate buffs for each side, but we weren't 100% sure you could put literal opposite alignment buffs on them, and she didn't want to risk getting screwed by some weird rule, so in the end they settled for casting Unholy on a backup weapon of hers. As far as the episode was concerned, I thought it was simpler and cooler to go with her original plan of the ultimate chain of good and evil. There was also some talk of casting Detect Thoughts, but when they were discussing it, concerns were raised about the Outro's avatar, or whatever you call that lightning bolt form, moving into the cone, where they suspected Al's intelligence stat would be high enough to trigger the clause in the PHB description where backlash would stun the caster, ending the spell early. They ended up changing their minds and not even trying because of the combination of the chance it would be stopped by Rygax's protections and or saving throw, and the chance that Al, who they knew could read minds, might have perfectly copied Rygax's thoughts, defeating the purpose. And of course, Black didn't have True Seeing memorized, and it's too high level for Draven's usual cast any spell BS, so he would have needed downtime and a workshop to craft an actual scroll of it. Then there was the suggestion that Draven didn't want to give voice to that, as Black suggested, the final challenge could have been to kill the fake Rygax for the key, meaning if they had killed the real one, then let's kill him. This did restart a mostly unserious discussion of killing the remaining Rygax. And of course, Little One's assertion that, I really don't hate Rygax that much, restarted the same old complaints of Rygax withholding information, which very rapidly turned back to Little One declaring his hatred again. So, having the party backtrack to find that they had unleashed unlimited zombies into the forest was anything but a serious threat. But it was such a fun idea that as soon as I thought of it, I had to do it. Was it part of the original plan? No. I can't remember exactly what stage it occurred to me. The Outrome's realm was not very tightly planned overall, though I did have plenty of time to prep each challenge, since RL stuff was causing us to miss more weeks than we actually played around that time. Was there a way for them to have stopped the zombies from spawning? Absolutely. When Little One and Angel were trapped down in the basement in episode 58, there were 3 tunnels branching out from that intersection. At the end of each was a small wooden chest, and a hole up above from which zombies started to drop down. They could kind of tell from the sounds and other context clues that the zombies were shambling up to that hole from parallel tunnels up above them. What they didn't do was go up there looking for a source, which was understandable. I mean, that part of the challenge was set up pretty obviously. There were 3 chests, 1 in each hallway, and they correctly guessed that one of them held the other half of the key they needed. And gameplay was switching back and forth between those 2 down below and the rest of the party fighting the fire demons up above, so Little One and Angel knew the others needed their help, which gave them good reason to want to get the key and get back outside. But had they climbed to the upper tunnels and headed back towards the middle, wading upstream through the zombies, they would have found a room near the entry shaft where all 3 tunnels met, and in that space was an altar on which sat 3 heads. 1 preserved human head faced each tunnel, and from that altar 8 zombies were being conjured each round in each direction. At that stage, I would have described the 3 heads, each bearing an impassive, almost grim expression. A lantern-jawed, dark-skinned male with piercing eyes and short, almost shaved black hair. A tanned male with a strong mustache, sunken eyes, and long black hair. And a South Varandian, that's just in-universe description for people with Japanese or similar features, female with prominent cheekbones and long black hair. Now, beyond that, my plan gets a little fuzzy. I had not put in a lot of detail. Frankly, those descriptions were rewritten just now because I couldn't find them, because I think I had guessed, and correctly as it turned out, that they would not find this. But should they have found this spot, Outtro would have said something like, "You can only take 1. Now that would put in their heads the idea of taking, rather than just smashing the heads, though that by no means ensures that somebody wouldn't try to hammer them anyway. If they chose and removed one of the heads, or whacked one, which would have caused it to fall off the altar, the other 2 would drop down into the stone pedestal, being magically protected and unreachable. I don't know that I had a plan for this specifically, but looking back, I would hope that if they did attack a head, I would have had that damage, like wound or scar the face, but cause only very limited damage, after which further attacks would do nothing more. And the zombies would stop spawning. Mission accomplished. Now, because I hadn't planned this well, I would have had to figure out on the spot whether Al would have mentioned something about the Headless Horseman, especially since they had not seen the apparition yet at this point. Because, of course, one of the three heads is the true head of the Horseman, the one that could free them from their curse. So the next question is, why would the Outtro risk exposing this valuable artifact to his playthings? There are two answers, really. One, the Outro's ironclad sense of superiority. Al feels so superior to their playthings that they can amuse themselves immensely by placing this valuable thing, arguably a weakness, at least a slight one, in harm's way because Al knows there's no way these peons would find it, let alone manage to make use of it. But two, like with spirit bargains, which are governed by, or in some way accounted for, by the underlying ledger of the universe that we might call karma, similarly, the Outro's devilish demigod games have stakes that morals caught up in the game could never understand. In addition to tangible resources like the souls contained by those fire demons, yes, in this context, souls count as tangible, in addition to simple pride and to gaining or losing confidence of their lord and master Asmodeus, there are forms of influence and power which Al can gain or lose based on the results of toying with their invited guests. Now, this influence isn't quantifiable to you or I, though perhaps to the Rajas it might be. It isn't going to increase or decrease the Outro's ability to create and destroy matter within their realm, and may or may not impact their poorly defined ability to extend the borders slightly when it suits them. But Al gains more, in some mystic sense, by risking something. It's probably not a big gain, considering that it's a hidden treasure, with only a 1 in 3 chance to lose it, even if they found the heads upon the altar, and even if the heroes knew what to do with the true head of the night. That's a pretty small risk. But the value of the Outro's game would be tangibly lesser if they were not risking anything themselves. Were the Dispel Statues avoidable? Probably. I didn't have any particular plan for if they just dimension doored past. I probably would have let them get away with it, though the fact that I had made them so paranoid that they outright rejected the idea definitely felt like a win for me. The Archway was casting Greater Dispelling at caster level 20, so it had a good chance to dispel most of their stuff, just clear the slate for the final challenge. But it was pretty amusing the way it all went down, with Draven passing through and being dispelled, then starting to recast buffs, then Little One smashing it and the Shockwave getting him again. We were doing Theater of the Mind at this point, so Black could try to argue that he wasn't standing close when the portal broke down, but he had to have been next to the statue to try, and fail, to cast Stone Shape on the wall, and there's a lava moat between him and the zombie path. Lava which Black was definitely not crossing back and forth over. A point worth noting, Draven's Fly and Heroism buffs both come from Eternal Wands. They cost about the same as normal wands, but instead of the normal 50 charges, which you can spend as quickly as you want until it burns out, Eternal Wands have 2 daily charges, which is definitely more my style, because they'll last forever. But of course, a regular wand of Fireball can be used to cast a Fireball every round in a pinch for massive firepower, whereas an Eternal Wand doesn't allow big bursts. You can never exceed those 2 castings per day. But since Draven relied on that wand for his fly spell, once he'd cast it and had it dispelled, twice, he couldn't cast it again. I mean, he could spend one of his infusions, but those are the same infusions he uses for important combat buffs. He couldn't justify spending one of those on a personal vanity fly spell in a 17-foot tall plane. I'm a little annoyed that I never drew the fully collapsed version of the broken statue, because it should have crumbled all the way to the ground, and I just left it frozen there at the point where it snapped enough to trigger the Dispel Explosion. But that late in the process, I really wanted to get the episode done, and the Headless Horseman section was only half finished, so I just cut the corner on that one. When Black was getting all his shit dispelled, somebody mentioned persistent spell house rules, and I guess I have to address that. When we were getting ready for the campaign, discussing the setting document, etc., I had a bunch of ideas for custom rules. Some worked well, others didn't. But one idea where the players and I collaborated was on trying to fix the persistent spell metamagic feat. Normally with this feat, you cast a spell 6 levels higher. So to persist a level 1 spell, you have to use a 7th level slot. And in exchange for this insanely expensive cost, you change the duration of that spell to 24 hours. The much cheaper Extend spell metamagic feat lets you double a spell's duration by casting it 1 level higher. But if you extend a 1 round per level spell, even if you're level 10, that spell's only going to last like 2 minutes, meaning it's usually only good for a single encounter or at most 2. If you persist a 1 round per level spell though, that short duration buff suddenly lasts all day, which can be a big deal because those short durations often go with powerful combat buffs. But the high cost, and the fact that made it usable only on level 1 to 3 spells, and probably only worth it for very short duration ones, all made it pretty uncommon to use it, unless you had some trick to make it much cheaper, which Draven would have had, because there's a level 3 infusion, aka Artificer spell, which he could use to apply a metamagic feat to a spell without the normal cost, meaning that at the lower levels, he could have given himself 2 persistent effects each day if he was willing to spend the castings. That seemed pretty bloody overpowered. What we wanted to try was making persistent still care what the spell's original duration was. So instead of duration becomes 1 day, we changed it to increase the duration of the spell by 1 increment, which means that where extend multiplies duration by 2, persistent is just a bigger multiplier. So a spell that lasts in rounds would upgrade to minutes. A spell which lasted a number of minutes would jump to that many hours, and any spell with a printed duration in hours would become 24 hours, though you'd probably never use persistent for that. This both stops you from totally circumventing the short durations, which are there to balance those powerful combat buffs, yet still allows you to make those spells last a much longer span of time, especially the spells that last 1 minute per level, or to bump up a medium duration spell into something that lasts most or all of the day. Of course, it's also a lot less powerful, so the level adjustment, the cost, needs to be lower than +6. And discussing with the players, we ended up going with +3, which felt a bit low to me, but that's what the players thought was appropriate, and it wasn't unreasonable, so I figured we'd give it a try. This is why Black has, for a long time, had his Hamatulabarb spell running all the time. Normally it's 10 minutes per caster level, so at level 12 it would have lasted him 2 hours. But with our 3-cost persistent spell, he had it lasting in hours per level instead, which, even by character level 8, would last a whole adventuring day. By now it's basically every waking hour. He's also using his powerful Divine Metamagic feat to replace the normal higher level spell cost of Metamagic, like per persistent spell, with some of his daily Turn Undead attempts. And while he didn't have as many different buff spells as his Fear of Dispelling made it sound like he did, the ones he did have cost him a pile of Turn Undead attempts in addition to the spells themselves. Plus, of course, since they were de facto all-day buffs, he obviously didn't memorize backup copies with which to recast them for the, hopefully, final battle. My supporters on Patreon get extras videos about a week early so that I can answer a bunch of their questions in the final videos using completely arbitrary voices. Though, of course, the really hot questions like, which Rygax was fake, and did they kill the right one? We'll have to wait, so instead you get these. Lord of Monies asked, were those other 2 heads anyone important? Also, Al clearly didn't bother to turn off the zombie fountain. Will they ever? Or just leave it running long enough to fill their entire realm with zombies until it overflows? Well, they are real, magically preserved heads, so I'm sure they were important to their owners. But no, as soon as the PCs die, or escape, Al will just erase all the zombies, or deanimate and rebury them. This kind of thing can be funny for a while, but Al has higher design standards than to just allow their realm to be overrun with cruddy corpses. Komnenos Maraslidis, whose name I'm sure I've read before, but I'm worried that I never read it carefully or properly, asked,
"Why were the heads used to produce endless zombies, and more importantly, how?"
For the last part, it's basically Al can create infinite zombies trivially, so it's really just dungeon mastering on the demigod's part. The heads are the source for the zombies, just because they have historical karma-type value or importance. But within this realm, it could literally just rain zombies for no reason, if the Outtro so wished. Skyder97 asked,
"What would happen if an enemy gave the Headless Horseman another head?" "Then killed him!"
Nothing much. Only the knight's original head would stop them from coming back. Skyder97 also asked,
"Weird question. Does the asshole demigod have any friends?"
Obviously, there's no reason that a powerful immortal being, even a demigod, couldn't make friends. Most of the vampire kings have friends, or have had friends in the past. Lockhart is one of the least sociable former humans you'll ever find, but he and his lieutenant Carve, who most people would also rate a 0 on the personality scale, have been together so long that their mutual business-like respect has evolved into something you could only call friendship. But you run into inevitable issues when befriending mortals. They last for a blink of an eye, then they're gone. Some beings take that time as a blessing, treasuring the memories, but others feel the loss as though each dead friend is a piece torn out of them, which can eventually leave them bitter, numb, even hollow. The Outtro, however, is, as you say, an asshole. I have a hard time picturing Al having enough respect for another being to see them as a real friend. Obviously, Al respects Asmodeus, but that's all fear and power. Double Lucky asked,
"You said that Al took the attempt to send Cardord back home as an opportunity to sow discontent amongst the party. But since Al made this fake, and can read the party's thoughts, and he also made the fake Cornello, couldn't he have set everything up to create the situation in the first place? And would Al have the ability to replicate the specific anti-divination effect of the doctrine?"
As you say, Cardord was himself a fake, and though the orc didn't specifically ask for a portal, he is the one who said,
"Unless you can send me back,"
he was going to attack. Al did copy the effect of the Darktree's aid, which is basically just permanent caster level 20 non-detection, but it's uncertain whether the trickster actually understood the source, since I don't recall the players actually checking Rygax's wrist for the mark, which is more than just invisible, because Little One couldn't see it till he got his own copy of the scar. One might ask, then, as Double Lucky did, whether the magic of the Darktree's boon shields your own memories of it against divination, or divination-adjacent effects. I mean, the Darktree itself is easy to find. People usually don't want to, what with the crazy psionic defenses. But what goes on within that particular ancient spirit organism is very powerfully concealed. 9 asked,
"What are Al's favorite demons to use in combat-focused trials?"
Well, honestly, Al doesn't really care. They much prefer to tailor their challenges, demons or otherwise, to whatever they think will mess with your head, cause confusion within your group, or play hardest on your psychological traumas. I, however, am partial to Glabrizu. I just think they're neat. Arthur D. Gonzalez Martin asked,
"So I guess Al doesn't have his own champion? The way Rygax is Enku's champion."
Not unless you count the Headless Horseman, but that's really not the same sort of thing. The Outtro has not imbued anyone else with power the way Enku has. It's possible that because of Al's internal focus, their ability to extend power outside their own realm is not great enough to make it worthwhile, and obviously there's no point inside. If Al wants to accomplish anything outside their borders, they need to work some kind of scheme. Bob Chipman asked,
What sort of powers would Outtro grant to a vampire king if spirit shackled?
It's hard to say, because it's never been done, and the powers granted by shackles often don't flow logically from the nature of those spirits. But although there's not a clear qualitative difference between a demigod and another powerful spirit, to shackle a being of such power would be a ludicrously difficult enterprise. Though, I can't say impossible. It's hard to imagine what it could do, and there's a significant chance that it wouldn't be worth it. There's just no way to tell what you would get. Patrick Rooney asked,
So what are the actual physical or magical capabilities of the Headless Horseman? And if he went up against a party, would they have been able to beat him? For a time, because he's immortal.
I mean, they haven't fought the Horseman yet in the videos, so who knows exactly. But you can expect moving out of the ground, which I really just like as a villainous attribute apparently, having a nightmare with its smoke cloud and junk, and smashing things with flaming evil chains. One thing which is not clear but may be implied by the legend is that if Asmodeus promised the knight would serve until their head was taken by an enemy, perhaps the warrior was protected against other forms of harm. In rules terms, really any form of damage reduction would make you supernaturally tough against any normal forces, though probably having less effect on heroes as powerful as the party. Then again, during the period when the knight only served evil by night, it could have been a weird situation where, if slain but not decapitated, maybe they'd just wake up in their bed in the morning? Who knows? William Bailey asked,
As cool as the acid trap was, jumping from pillar to pillar, it made me wonder, as a DM, how would you feel if you killed one of your player characters because of one or two bad rolls that was basically out of their control?
In this case, I'd feel the same as basically any way a PC dies in combat. The acid isn't instant death. Little one sat in it for a round in the entry room. It just does a bunch of damage. So if somebody fell and failed to catch themselves on a pillar on the way down, they or their allies would have to figure out a way to rescue them. It's definitely a pain in the ass, and pretty dangerous with a-holes spamming fireball from above. But at this level, I don't think it's unreasonable for PCs to be expected to find a way to use their resources to either avoid the fall or to rescue somebody who drops down. That said, it would have been real awkward if somebody had died in the middle of the challenges. If they die in the last one, fine. It would be about as rough as any regular D&D death, because either they TPK, or the survivors presumably get sent home where they could meet a brand new backup character. But if somebody died before the final room, then bringing them back in with a new character would be messy. Yes, the Outtro could actually have sucked somebody else in somehow, similar to what was being feigned with Shadow Cudthroat, but to have the PCs trust such a newcomer in here would have been much harder to swallow than Krillidin's convenient decision to stick with the party instead of portaling out of the Shadowfell along with the NPCs. 3C273 asked,
A few questions from rewatching older videos. 1. Was there a difference between the two keyholes? The map shows them linking to the same place, but was the trap any different or just messing with the player's heads?
Nope, the two keyholes both work the same. It's just messing with them. 2 copies, in case that's a hint at something. Alternatively, it could be seen as the illusion of choice, but mostly just inserting doubt wherever possible.
2. Somewhat related to the vampires, back in episode 27, Black remembers the Kings Beneath a Shallow Sky rhyme. Was this added just for the videos and or narrated by you after a knowledge check, or did Black's player actually remember it from his backstory?
I created the rhyme and reminded the player of it from his father's stories when he was a child, around that time. In character, it was uttered by Black, though.
3. In Extras number 8, and possibly that episode, there is a mention of a third portal facility besides Porleron and Ginneron. Is it a spoiler to ask where it would have been and what it would have looked like if the players had investigated it?
The third such facility will have to remain mysterious. Who knows where they might go when we restart after hiatus? They probably won't go there, but who knows? The reason it's mentioned is part of my expanding the world sort of philosophy, though. Ever notice how in Star Trek, whenever somebody is listing historical figures, they almost always give 2 names from real human history, then a third made-up one from our future, which is still the past for them, or from another species. Similarly, whenever I list several things in my world, whether it's cities or mercenaries from the organization or whatever, I try to add an extra one which I probably have just made up on the spot. Adding an item to the list that doesn't show up in the game already makes the world feel bigger in a sense, that the players aren't seeing everything there is to see. But it also means that I now have this one extra name that I might think about and end up adding information to the setting. Finally, Arthur D. Gonzalez Martin also asked,
"Where do you get most of your inspiration for the monsters and gods of your world? I can see bits and pieces from Forgotten Realms or Ravenloft."
I don't know if there's any particular place I can point to. Not Ravenloft. I'm aware of the setting, but that's about it. Haven't read anything there. I do use a lot of Forgotten Realms stuff because it's been the default setting for so many D&D editions. All the old monster manuals I poured over back in the day, and my Pantheon definitely uses a modified 3rd edition Player's Handbook Pantheon as a base, which is again Forgotten Realms default. But most of everything is just general cultural osmosis, stuff from sci-fi movies and anime. A lot of general anime feel stuff living in my head, not tied to particular shows. Not that I can remember or identify anyhow. Just a reminder, in case you missed the message, but the next major video will be a short-ish, mostly action, hopefully well-animated Legends, which I've been putting off for well over a year, and which will probably take about as long as an episode to produce. Then I'll get back to making episode number 62, The Final Challenge, which may or may not be the final name for it, and will not be the final episode of this series of TDDC. Lore Master patrons should be pleased to know, though, that after leaving it for like a year because I was stuck, I reread what I have so far of Mage Captain Sahara, and damn, I love the characters and their interactions. So I'm back to working on that, and hoping to get Chapter 8 finished sometime soon. Though because it's so ridiculous to write and release a novel linearly, there may be a lot of edits to this story someday down the line. I hate that thanking you every time makes it feel like the thanks all run together and sound less special, more rote. But I can't thank my Patreon patrons enough for paying my bills so I can keep focusing on making stuff as awesome as I can for you and for everybody who's watching for free. But due to their disproportionate contributions, I owe a special thanks to
Ethamordu, Oust, Aurelius, Bedamir, Big Grin, Critical Hit 20, Garnlin, Dimon, Earl of Sanguin, Warsaw, Fay, Crossroads, Fireborn, Fright Night, Gore, Fiend, Hagoon, 9, General Mo, John, Lieutenant Red, Lunny, Doe, Lord Aelin, Mad Brewer, Zach, Malison, Dash MG3D, Norgren, OI1, Olden Man, Overlord Thord, Pedruga, Vruni, Pontus Prison Cat, Rammer Ulfist, Rep Mock, Scatter 9, 7, Stand the Men, Starfall, Sygax, Tambu and June, Doshiro 7, Valis, Volking, WA, Soul, Woodley, Zombie, members of the organization. Thank you for supporting me. These readings can't all be winners. What do you want?